So as far as the training tip of the week and what we want to talk about this week is we want to talk about the top three tax deed risks. As you're investing in the tax deeds, these are the three things that we're usually going to need to watch out for, and they're going to be the most important in buying real estate through a tax deed foreclosure auction.
Yeah, I think you know, when you are so I guess the risks with tax sale investing vary a little bit depending on what it is that you're buying. For instance, if you're buying liens, we're going to be looking at some liens, tonight that are really very safe investments, incredibly secure because, well, and you'll see why exactly they have so much security to them. But it's different when you're buying deeds because you're buying the property outright, and that includes buying anything that comes along with it. And so if there are liens, if there's things attached to the property, if there are if there's encumbrances that can cost you money, those are also attached, and that's a risk. And it's actually one that's fairly common, for tax sale properties. So it's one we need to be able to look into. But these are the top three risks that we need to look out for when we are buying tax deeds.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those risks, the number one being usability. You've always heard us talk about, or anyone that's been part of our trainings, we talk about having both use and value. And that's going to be definitely important. We need to make sure that the property is usable. Now, in something like a home, that's pretty basic. If it's something like a home, there's some use to it, or there was some use to it. When we're talking about land investing, which there's a lot of land in tax sales, we really need to check into some of those things about the land before making a decision.
In fact, I think this is probably one of the bigger risks, that investors face, because really the risk that lies here is of picking up property that's basically junk. This is kind of the same thing as junk land, but this is looking into it a little bit more specifically and why it's junk land. It is about understanding what makes it junk land, and that really comes down to usability. Um, Usability is something that it's funny. Originally, if we were looking at an overhead map, and if the lots all looked like they were the same size, and we just figured, oh, everything's usable. But that's not how it works. We figured that out very quickly, that the usability is actually determined, by very specific parameters that we can find and define. But we don't want to buy until we've defined what those parameters are, and we make sure that our property meets those parameters. Because if we buy a property that falls outside of that, as good as it might look, it's not going to be usable. It's not going to be buildable, and therefore the value is probably not going to be very high on it either.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's important that we research for the minimum lot size for any commercial residential property that we're buying. Just like Shade said, you can't just look at an overhead map and say, "Oh, that lot looks like it's the same size as the other lots." It's buildable. It may have been buildable at one time, but what's happened over the last 20 years is some of these towns and cities have changed their zoning codes. So maybe a quarter acre lot used to be buildable, but now it's a third acre lot. So in looking in that quarter acre lot, you may think that, hey, this is a great lot, it's buildable, but if you actually get into the code, you can't build on it. And so if you can't build on it, we're really limiting the value of that property. Who can we sell it to? Maybe the next door neighbor. And if they're not interested in it, who can we sell it to from them? Really nobody. And so in that kind of situation, we bought a property that has no usability, which really means that it has no value, regardless if the county has placed value on it or not. It has no value because we can't sell it to anyone.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to with these properties is, our ability to sell them, is going to be very hindered, because no, we can't just sell them to anybody. The only people that are really going to buy a property like that might be an adjacent property owner, somebody that can extend their property a little bit. But, even then, that's a very small pool of potential buyers. And so, yeah, the ultimately usability is going to be determined by property zoning and the zoning ordinances, that have been passed, or the codes, whichever the terminology is here they use. But basically, the ordinances are just laws, and they're laws that the local town or city, have passed. And like Steve was saying, they change over time. And in fact, it's interesting. You can, if you follow counties and their public announcements and their public notices section, you'll see where they address things that come up, and certainly changing things like the minimum requirements there for lots is something that they do. And sometimes they do it with this idea that somehow that they're going to be able to increase the value, or they're trying to bring up the value of real estate. And so they figure if they require bigger lots, that somehow they won't. I don't know. I guess that's what their thinking is when they do that. But it's something that we've seen over and over again, in many areas, because you might have neighborhoods that were developed originally, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so since then, there's been quite a bit of time for them to make up changes like that if they want.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely something we're going to be researching, as we're buying any type of property. Now, when we're talking about land and specifically land risk, there's a couple of different types. In fact, there's really many types. One of them that we're going to find is landlocked properties. We'll usually avoid any type of landlocked property because we don't have any legal access to the property. Again, who are we going to sell it to? Even if the property is surrounded by 4 different owners, you're going to have one of those owners that will either want to be able to buy the property or allow you an easement to access through their property to your property, which is going to be pretty tough to find somebody who's just willing to be able to do that. And so when it comes to landlocked properties, side lots, anything like that, we're going to completely avoid those type of properties.
Yeah, and in fact, I know that these risks apply to tax deeds, but actually, as I'm thinking about it, they really kind of apply to liens too, if you're looking, because as we were looking at some of the liens, I saw a lien that's in the current sale, that is for a thin plot of land, like it's a strip, that's only maybe 5 or 10 feet wide and maybe 50 to 100 feet long. Totally useless in terms of, from us as investors. And so at the same time, it is a risk with liens, and at least with liens, we do at least do as much as pulling up, the records and seeing what the property is. And so, it is easy to avoid a risk like that, but definitely gets identified. As soon as you pull up the map, you realize, that it's one of these types of properties you want to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, well, even in risk, we've always talked about, the property having both use and value. And so we may not go necessarily and look into the minimum building lot if we're looking at a lot and has value. But in any of these type of properties that are going to be what we consider to be junk land, you're going to completely avoid buying them regardless if it's a lien or a tax deed, because if we did bought it as a lien, we wouldn't want to acquire that property anyway. In fact, sometimes, well, properties that are like swampland, low value land. In fact, sometimes we'll see properties that are, nothing but an easement. For example, like a road or even a utility easement, where, even though the land may have some value, the utility of the easement automatically makes the property unusable. In fact, it reminds me of a story, something that happened years ago where we had been approached by a couple of investors that ended up buying a property in Texas that had utility towers and cell towers on it. And they thought by buying the property, they could automatically, charge all of these cell providers and utility providers essentially rent because it's on their land, not realizing that easement allowed them to do that for free. And that's the reason the property was sold in the tax sale to begin with.
Yeah, yeah, you're not going to you're not going to outwit, these big corporations that are worth all this kind of money that easily, with something like that. There's a reason why they let the property go in the first place, or why they didn't pay the property taxes, and it's probably because it didn't matter if they did or didn't. In either case, their easement, grants them access to the property for that purpose. And so, even if the property is owned by whoever, it doesn't really matter because they have the legal right to access it. So therefore, owning it doesn't really matter. But yeah, anytime you see something, I mean, If you see anything that looks like it is something that is operated by the government or that's been placed there by the government, it's an indication of an easement, most likely, and will certainly hamper your ability to do anything else with the property. So those are things we always look for, just like we always look for things like water features or things that might, be indications that the property has other problems. You have to be aware of all types, because a lot of times those problems are not, you can't always tell right off the bat until you dig into them a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The second one that we're going to watch for, the second biggest risk, is going to be government liens. Generally speaking, when we're talking about the judicial foreclosure process, which is the tax foreclosure process, it's going to go through what's called a judicial foreclosure. Now, that judicial foreclosure, it removes any existing financial debts and obligations, things like mortgages, judgments. But what can stick to those properties is things like government liens. There's a number of different government liens that aren't going to be extinguished through that judicial foreclosure process, which means when you buy that tax deed property, those liens are still going to attach to it even after you purchased it.
Yeah, this is a problem. Well, I guess it's a risk that we can avoid by doing some research, doing some title research. Actually, is what we're going to do, or how we're going to find it. But the types of liens that we run into, there's a variety that you can see. Although by far the most common type that we run into are ones that have been issued by the local government there, which is usually going to be, city, village, town, something along those level. And the most common types of liens are usually going to be either a nuisance lien, or like a cleanup lien, or sometimes we see things like assessment liens and things like that are issued as well. Um, but by far, those are going to be the liens that you're going to come across most commonly, and especially, with tax sale properties. These are properties that I think also have maybe a higher chance of having these types of liens than just regular properties. And so we need to be extra diligent when we're looking, at properties for liens, because also sometimes we come across state liens as well. We see state liens, we research them all the same way. So we see IRS liens, we see state liens, but yeah, by far most common is going to be city liens. Medical liens are actually, those are an issue as well. In fact, they're kind of a big issue in certain places. Like Oklahoma, they're kind of an issue.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When we're talking about government lien types, like Shade said, I would say 80%, 90% of the liens are going to be some type of city lien, whether that be a grass cut lien, they had to send somebody out there to mow the grass down. In fact, that's something that we're looking at as we're researching the property, looking at the overhead maps. If we see a building lot that has grass and has been mowed recently, that's automatically a kind of a red flag to us, as who's mowing that grass. Chances are it's this sending somebody out there from the city to be able to do that, which means that there's going to be cost involved. And if the cost is involved, what the city will do is go ahead and place a lien against it. So we can occasionally see state liens. We can see medical liens in certain states. We can occasionally see an IRS lien. With state, city, and medical liens, those are liens that essentially attach to the property and that will need to be paid. With the IRS lien, it's really just more a waiting period. You'll fill out a form. If there's an IRS lien, the IRS has 120 days to either take ownership of the property by paying off what you paid for the property, or taking ownership of the property. And from our experience, most of the time they'll go ahead and take ownership of it. They'll go ahead and release the lien, and versus trying to take ownership of it.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, that's nearly, I think, what happens most of the time. In fact, we've got a good question here, and it is, if you search the official records for a property owner and find deeds and liens and such, could there be liens that aren't located in the records? And if so, where could they be found? Uh, so I guess it depends on what types of things, that we're looking for here. But if we're talking about a property that's owned by, let's say, a single individual, um, the way that we know that there aren't additional liens that are out there, is because we're going to look up and find anything that has come up, or anything that's been issued against the property since the time that this owner has owned it. And we're going to go back to the time that it had a warranty deed last, right? So we're going to go back. So let's say that this owner, when they purchased it, it was with a warranty deed, which is not uncommon. Usually it is with the warranty deed, when it's done with properties and financing. And so we know at the time of the warranty deed that property is free and clear of any kinds of liens or encumbrances. That's the reason why we look back to the time where it had a warranty deed. Um, so from that time forward is really what we're concerned about. And if there is a single property owner there that we're looking at, then if there are liens, they would have to be issued against that individual. At least I don't know that it's possible for liens to exist against a property and have them not be issued against the property owner first. I think it almost has to be. And so I don't know that it is possible to have other kinds of liens out there, unless you've got additional property owners that are there and that you haven't searched up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as far as our options, what are our options in finding out about these liens? Well, there's really two different options. There's a professional title search and what we call an investor title search. When me and Shade first got started back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of information available. In fact, there was just two books that had been printed that we could find, and many of them were 5, 10, 15 years old. But at that time, really the recommendation in buying tax deed property was to have a professional title search done. Now, when we first got started, we didn't have, we had limited capital to begin with. And even with my discount of being a real estate agent, it still may cost, if we had 20 or 30 properties we were interested in researching, to have a title report done on each one of those, maybe a few grand. And so, that wasn't a real good option for us there in the beginning. But as the internet started changing things, that opened up our options in researching the titles without just having a professional title search done.
Yeah, it was a total game changer. Because previously, I mean, you could do this kind of research, but you had to be inside a county records building, in order to do it. That's where you could find things like liens. And so really all that's happened today is we just have, now we have internet access to those same records, so we can perform the same research. But this is, you're going to find all the liens that exist against a property, using these methods. In fact, your options, you could still have like a lien report done on a property, which in some cases that might still be the best way to go, especially if you can't access the records you need to. So let's say that you're dealing with the county that doesn't have their official records online. If that's the case, then you could pay for a lien report to be done. But from our experience, though, even with lien reports, we're finding the exact same things that a lien report is going to find, because essentially we're going through the same process that the lien report is going through to find liens. They're going through the same way. They're not really finding the liens any other way than what we are, which is essentially looking through the records associated with the property owner's name. And so, another question here was about child support, which that's actually another one that is kind of like the medical liens, where it can be an issue in some states. At least, those liens can stick, and they're liens that are issued by a government entity, so they don't just drop off, after the foreclosure. That is kind of one of the risks of. Now, I also don't think, though, that you're going to be liable for somebody else's child support. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to be a headache to deal with a little bit. We've typically tried to avoid those, but yeah, in some areas that we've been to sales before where, they handed out, big rings of paper that were just full of medical liens, or that were full of different types of liens like that, that were against some of the properties. And so it is something that can come up, and that we try to look for as well. But even a medical lien should be issued the same way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So really, with the internet bringing all of those records online, that really opened up the ability for us to do these investor title searches. We first started seeing it in the early 2000s, and it's just become more and more available, where more and more counties are making these records available online. And part of it is because it's easier for them as well. The counties, have staff there, and back in the day, you needed to go down and research the property, and then the staff would need to go through and look up and find that information and then print it off. And so it was this whole ordeal. And there's still some counties that we'll go to with some of our buying tours, where we take some of our students and take them to an actual auction, where in certain areas we'll still go into the county courthouse to do some of that research. But what has changed is the county's making those records available online. So now we can just go ahead and use that owner's name and search that owner's name in the recorder's records or the clerk's records, and be able to pull up any government liens that attach to that owner's name.
In fact, and one other quick question is, how long do liens last? They say they're looking to buy a 20-acre lot that was owned by a dissolved corporation 20 years ago. The answer to that actually depends completely upon the state and what their statute of limitations are, because it varies but from state to state. In some places, it might only be 5 years or 6 years or 7 years. In other places, it might be. In Texas, I've seen them with liens that are over 20 years old. I've seen them still trying to collect taxes from they're over 20 years old. And so it depends on the state laws, that the property resides within.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a number of states where those liens are never going to be extinguished, unless you're able to work out a deal with those individual counties or cities. So it's important to look that up, and take into account. That's the reason when we're researching a property, we're always going to find out what liens are against that property, and then try to negotiate that amount down with the individual cities. Now, the third thing that we're going to look at, especially having to do with structures, homes, is the condition. When we're talking about land, there can be some condition issues to a degree, but it is kind of what it is dirt. But when we're talking about, something like a structure, a home, a commercial property, the condition can make a property worthless regardless of how much you bought it for. So there may be homes that you can buy for $100 or $1,000 or $2,000 in areas of the country, through a land bank or an over the counter. But how much is it going to cost to rehab that property? Isn't financially worth it. If the property's only worth 60 grand and it's going to cost 80 grand in rehabbing, you're not going to make any money. You're going to lose money.
Yeah, that's the other side of it, is that it oftentimes it's directly associated with the value of the property as well. So it's a combination of the condition of the structure and the value, that it holds. And the lower the value of it, something like, for instance, the riskiest properties that we find are the properties that have a limited value. So let's say that they're valued at 50,000 or 60,000. Because those properties really can't afford to have too much put into them in terms of rehab. You know, um, Before, you're obviously in a position there where you're not going to make money, where it becomes a money pit, and that's the real risk that we face with condition. In fact, I don't know how many other ways we should tell people, that absolutely in no case don't ever buy properties, improve properties, without getting some kind of a current image of what the condition of the property is like, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up, to most likely be disappointed or run into major problems if you just buy sight unseen, which we've seen people do it and lose tens of thousands, uh, so much money. In fact, every time you go to a large or big auction, you're going to see people make this same mistake over and over again. And usually it's new people, but they go ahead and buy some kind of improved property, jump on it, or bid on it, without actually knowing what the condition is, and that's the biggest factor for us on these properties. I mean, there are properties that that you couldn't pay me to take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We see this on a monthly basis as we go out and attend different auctions. As we're going through and doing our evaluation, we'll put together a driving route of the properties that we want to go past and take photos. And, on the online evaluation, the property may look pretty good, and in fact, just even looking at this example, this is one of the examples of a property that we were looking at as a couple of years ago. But that property right there, if we're looking at it from the Google Street View, it looks like we can see a car there. You can see the light on. The grass is green. It looks like it's being used and lived in. Within a couple of years, a year or two, after this photo was taken, we went and did an actual on-site evaluation. And you can see that this property has some serious damage. First of all, we can tell it's abandoned. Some of the windows have been bolted up, but if we actually boarded up, but if we actually look in the front window, we can see that the window is wide open. So this is a property that a couple of years ago may have been a livable property, but now, based on the condition and also based on the value, this property doesn't make any sense. Now, if this property was located, let's say in Phoenix, Arizona, which we're going to be looking at in Arizona liens here in a little bit, or in an area where this property, instead of being worth 60 to 70 grand, is maybe worth 180 grand or 200 grand, well, then maybe fixing up a beat up property could make sense because the real estate value of the area is so high that it makes sense to buy it. But in a property like this, where the value is so low within the area, maybe it's worth 60 to 80 grand, we could easily put in 60 grand worth of repairs, and it may not even be livable at that point.
Yeah, that's the real problem, is that the numbers quickly, don't work if the value of the property is low and the conditions, if the repairs needed are many, and it's pretty easy to run out of money or to end up in a situation like that where you're not going to be profitable. And so, yeah, there are tons of ways to get current images. In fact, it's never been easier to find people to do this kind of work than it is today. You just have to get some kind of a current image. I mean, Steve talked about us driving properties. We like to drive the properties before we bid on them for that exact reason. Even at land, actually, driving land has actually turned out to be more beneficial than than we would realize as well. Because in some cases, we'll go and drive the land, and it teaches you quite a bit about the neighborhood, and you learn things about the property by being there. And that you may not if you can't be there. But if you can't, these are all different individuals that you could hire or send out potentially to get things like photographs done.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I talked a little earlier about creating a route. That's the same thing we do if we're doing it ourselves. So if we're going out there and driving the properties before the auction with some of our students, or if we're hiring somebody, whether that be a handyman or a photographer, to go out there and take photos with us. And so as we create that route, let's say we have 10 homes that we are interested in, we can put those into Google Maps or any of those map features and figure out exactly how long it's going to take for an individual to drive this route, and then put in time to take photos, maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes at each property to take some photos of that property, and we can get an idea of how long it's going to take. So if we're hiring a photographer or a handyman, or if we're just putting an ad in the classifieds, we've got an idea of how much it's going to cost based on how much time's going to be involved. So if maybe it's going to take 2 hours, maybe we're willing to pay them $100 or $125 or whatever it is to be able to go past and drive these routes based on the time that it takes them to do it.
You know, um, we have another question from Lisa. That's just a really good question that I wanted to address here. It says, she's saying, please recommend brokers that buy tax deed lots. Retailers only want to buy marketable title, not with cloud. This is a good question. I think that probably one of the things is how we approach it's a little bit different. So when it comes to tax deed lots that we are selling, we usually take either a wholesale approach, where we're going to wholesale the properties using a quick claim deed, in which case, we're selling it through a number of different methods and sources here. We're not really selling it to retailers, per se, because again, we're able to offer it at a discounted rate, but it is still, we're going to sell it with a clouded title, but using that quick claim deed. And so if the value of the property though is good enough, if it's over, let's say, over $20,000 in value, then it's probably going to make sense to do something to clear up or to make that, to get marketable title, as you say, to get title insurance essentially for it. And that's where it's probably going to make sense, because if it's a $50,000 plus, property, you obviously wouldn't want to discount that dramatically, and there's no need to either. You can just go through the process to get, to make the deed marketable.
Yeah, and there's always options like tax title services and things like that that will provide title insurance. So if somebody does have an issue, at least they could buy it with title insurance by using clear to sell or tax title services. So as far as the final thoughts, buying land that's not usable severely limits who we can sell the property to. It's important that we go through and research government liens using the name of the owner. And something we don't have time to talk about, in this training, but as our members, we have trainings about stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 due diligence and researching the title, and how we need to go through and research the deed as well. Because if the deed is not as a non-warranted deed, let's say the last deed or the last time it was sold was using a quitclaim deed, well, then we're going to have to research more than one owner. We're going to have to research that first owner and the second owner. So there's a lot of research that's going to go involved with buying tax deed properties. But as long as we've gone through and we've checked the things like usability, we've checked the zoning, we've checked for government liens, and if there is government liens, we know how much they are. We've negotiated or spoken with the city if we do acquire the property about paying off those liens afterwards. And when it comes to structured properties, we're doing an online evaluation. We're usually going to be safe from making any major mistakes.